The NHL announces the quarter-century team for the New York Rangers. Did anybody get snubbed? And do Chris Kreider and Mika Zibanejad deserve their spot on the first team?
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1237 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, yeah, as I mentioned, the NHL has been doing these quarter-century teams for all the different NHL franchises, and we know the members that now make up the Rangers quarter-century teams. And I figured this would be a good time to do something a little bit different on here, sort of lower the temperature. I know a lot of us were really upset about these last two losses against the Avalanche and then the Canes for completely different reasons. Both those games are vastly different from each other, but the thing they have in common is the Rangers lost both of them in regulation and missed out on a whole bunch of points that they desperately need right now. So that's kind of where things stand as far as the current Rangers. But we're going to, again, shift the attention here to the quarter-century team. Some interesting, members made this team, and maybe some interesting players that were notably absent from either one of these teams. So we go through it, share my thoughts, and talk about if anybody got snubbed, if anybody on the first team should be on the second team, vice versa. You guys get the idea. Again, let's do something a little different, have a little bit fun here today after obviously a tense couple of days for Ranger fans for sure. So the way this works is the first and second teams were selected by broadcasters, national, local, and NHL.com writers who have covered the respective teams in addition to select former players. So basically what this is it's looking at the track record for Rangers, that what they did on the team between January 1st, 2000 and January 1st, 2005, that 25-year window there. So, to take that into consideration here, one player that will not be on the list, a little bit of a spoiler here, I suppose, is Mark Messier. Now, if you look at like the complete body of work for Mark Messier, I mean, he would make any, all whatever team of any time. But when you look at what he did as a Ranger after 2000, I mean, he still put up respectable numbers. By then, he was in his second stint as a member of the Rangers, but it was so uneventful compared to obviously his first go around and the 94 Cup and everything. So Messier is one player that will be omitted. But now that we got the ground rules out of the way, let's just go ahead and run through it here. The second team at goalie, you've got Igor Shesterkin. We don't really have to have too much debate. There's not really a whole lot to say in terms of the goalies. We know Igor is going to be on the second team. And spoiler alert, Henrik Lundqvist will be on the first team. And there was really no other way to go. I mean, maybe Mike Richter deserves some consideration playing into the 2000s there, but it had to be Igor on the second team. It had to be Henrik on the first team. Both world-class goalies, both big-time playoff performers as well. So don't have to spend a whole lot of time on that. But as far as defensemen go, and again, we're going through the second team here. The two members of the second team for the defensemen were Dan Girardi and Mark Stahl. Two pillars of the Ranger blue line for many, many years. Girardi, he kind of fell apart near the end. I know that, when you look at this current Ranger team, to kind of keep things current a little bit too, because I want to mix in some of the current Rangers too into this discussion. There's some people that look at where Ryan Lindgren is and they compare it to Dan Girardi, and I understand those comparisons. Girardi was an absolute beast, and then toward the end, his body just started to break down. You can only play so many grueling minutes, so many grueling playoff games, block so many shots, throw out so many hits, take so many pucks to the face this guy did before you eventually, start to slow down a little bit. And that's eventually what ended up happening with Dan Girardi. But the guy was an absolute warrior. I don't think anybody that watched him play in his prime would try to argue that, try to deny that. Just very, physically tough player. Parts of 11 seasons with the New York Rangers for Dan Girardi. And, of course, part of the run to the 2014 Stanley Cup Final, part of some other deep playoff runs as well. He was an All-Star in 2012. 122 playoff games with the New York Rangers for Dan Girardi. That's a lot of hard-nosed minutes that this guy logged. 11th all-time in NHL history with 1,954 block shots. 1,913 of those came as a member of the Rangers, and he, of course, leads the Rangers in that stat in this quarter century. Also leads the Rangers in the quarter century with 1,798 hits. Got some Norris votes every once in a while, here and there. He finished as high as number 6 in the Norris, so fine choice here for Dan Girardi. Mark Stahl, Stahl, the everydayers are going to recognize this. I always felt like there were times where he was a little bit overrated as a Ranger, but I'm not so sure there's a better player to fill out this second quarter century team for the Rangers here. I mean, you got to respect the longevity. 892 games. That's the most of any Ranger in the quarter century. In addition, 107 playoff games for Stahl. So, yeah, played in the same era as Girardi. They were both part of, obviously, all those deep playoff runs. Pretty much every deep playoff run that Girardi had, Stahl was part of that as well. 1,308 hits, not points. That would be something else. 1,308 hits for Mark Stahl during his time with the Rangers there, and that puts him in 4th for the quarter century there. Second only to Girardi with 1,162 block shots. And like Girardi made an all-star team for Stahl, it occurred back in 2011. So, Stahl, there's times where I feel like he could be really up and down. There's times where I was really nervous, if I'm being honest, when he was on the ice. But, good choice here, I think, for sure. Jaromir Jagr, by the way, still playing hockey at the age of 52. As far as his time on the Rangers, he was an absolute beast. There's a lot of people thinking that he should have been on the first team of this quarter century list for the Rangers. Going to have some thoughts on that in a little bit. But, came to the Rangers, and it's just crazy to think that even then people were wondering if maybe Jagr was on the way down a little bit. But basically, revitalized his career with the Rangers coming over from the Caps. Obviously, he'd won a couple of cups with the Penguins before all of that. But you had that amazing season where he had 123 points in one season, just a season for the ages, basically. It's crazy also, too, to think that Jagr was only here for 3.5 seasons, which might be why he didn't make the first team, just didn't have enough longevity. But, I mean, he made the most out of it when he was here. 277 games, 124 goals, 195 assists, 319 points. And one other thing that might work against Jagr is that there wasn't a ton of team success while he was here. I know for sure that they never made it to the conference final while Jagr was here. And I think they only got to the second round twice. So that might work against him at least a little bit. But they made the playoffs in all of his last 3 seasons. And he was fantastic in the playoffs too. 10 goals and 17 assists in 23 games. But just never really made it all that far. They did beat the Devils the one year in the first round. That was a really fun series. They knocked them out in 5 games. That's when Jagr, there was a penalty shot for the Devils in game 5. And Lundqvist, of course, made the save to preserve the Ranger lead. And Jagr, after the game, said that he didn't watch the penalty shot because he knew Hank would stop it. So good stuff there. Also a member of the second team, we've got Derek Stepan, one of the homegrown players on this list. Hat trick in his NHL debut. He's got an iconic moment to his name. I think that's got to count for something in terms of putting together these rosters here. Of course, I'm talking about the Game 7 overtime winner against the Caps. Just another very, very important player to those mid-2010 Ranger teams. There's people who, I think even to this day, they're not really sure that Derek Stepan was ever like a bona fide number 1 center, but that's the role that he played a long time for the Rangers, and they won a lot during those seasons and obviously made some deep runs, made it to the Stanley Cup final. If he wasn't a true number 1 center, I mean, he was a high number 2 center, if you will, right on the verge of, 1, 2, whatever you want to call it. But for me, as well as he played, yeah, he was a number 1 center. I'll always remember, as far as like a memory of Stepan, obviously the Game 7 overtime winner, but also him wearing that fishbowl in the Stanley Cup playoffs that year after taking that big hit from Brandon Prust. But parts of 7 seasons with the Rangers for Derek Stepan, 515 games, 182 goals, 232 assists, 360 points. And then the playoffs, 97 playoff games, 49 points there. These are not staggering offensive numbers, but Derek Stepan, I think, above everything else for the Rangers, just a model of consistency. You could pencil him in every season for like 50, 55 points. He was going to give you good defensive hockey as well. Got some Selke votes over the years, finished as high as number 9 there with the Rangers. This is kind of interesting. As a 22-year-old, Derek Stepan was 9th in Selke voting and 7th in Lady Byng voting. it's not easy to be top 10 in both of those. They're kind of unique and they almost kind of contradict each other. Because if you really are like this shutdown defensive player, then you figure, you're gonna throw some weight around and do everything you can to keep the puck out of the net. But if you're getting Lady Bing votes as well, then you're obviously doing it in a very clean fashion as well. So that was kind of interesting when I looked that up. Didn't realize that about Derek Stepan. And then one more player for the second team here. It will be Matt Zuccarello. You talk about just some heart and soul players. This guy was certainly one of them. He had that horrifying head injury as a member of the Rangers, got hit in the helmet with a puck and wasn't able to talk for a spell there. Comes back and to this day remains a great player for the Minnesota Wild. We all knew the Rangers were rebuilding and whatnot. The letter went out and, the inevitable's coming. They're going to trade away a bunch of these players that we all, really are fans of. And, that's exactly what they did. But I don't think any of them hit this fan base nearly as hard as Matt Zuccarello. That was a tough one. And again, you kind of knew it was coming. But when it happened, it certainly was a little bit rough when that did occur. But 509 games with the Rangers for Zuccarello, parts of 9 seasons, 113 goals, 239 assists, 352 points, and not too shabby for a player who went undrafted. And if the Rangers don't make the playoffs this year, which seems more likely than not at this point, and even if they do, if they get knocked out, whatever happens, if we come to a point where the Rangers can't win the Stanley Cup this year, but the Wild can, the Wild are the team I'm going to root for, just because Matt Zuccarello is on that team, and I'd love to see him lift the Stanley Cup. So in just a second, going to shift gears, going to go ahead and talk a little bit about the first team, quarter century team for the New York Rangers, and we will do that in just a second. All right, we just want to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by Gametime. Attending NFL playoffs is an unforgettable experience that brings all fans together. I've been to a handful of NFL playoff games. I think most notably the Jets' 40-0 win over the Colts way back in the day. I remember the excitement and energy of the playoff games that I've attended over the years, and definitely looking forward to doing that, making some new memories at a future NFL playoff game. Gametime has a new feature called Gametime Picks that makes getting tickets for events even faster and even easier. It filters out the fluff to show you only incredible deals on great seats so that you do not have to waste time searching through thousands and thousands of tickets. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off of your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. Huge shout out to the everydayers. As always, the Rangers going to be back in action at 3:30 on Saturday afternoon against the Boston Bruins on the road in Boston. Whatever happens in that game, we'll break that one down in the episode after that, probably later that night. And then on Sunday, Rangers are going to host Vegas at 6 p.m. Same deal there. Obviously, we'll talk about whatever happens. For today, though, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling by moving from the second team to the first team, the quarter-century first team for the New York Rangers. Once again, to the surprise of literally no one that's ever watched Ranger hockey, the first-team goalie for the New York Rangers is, of course, Henrik Lundqvist. No real debates need to be had there. I think his track record pretty much speaks for itself, so we can go ahead and move on. Your defensemen for the quarter-century first team are Adam Fox and Ryan McDonagh. And when I saw these two listed together, one of the first thoughts that I had was that it's just such a shame that we never saw them as a pairing. That could have been a lot of fun. And they only miss each other by, I think, about 2 years. Obviously, McDonagh was one of many Rangers from that era, moved to facilitate the rebuild. And, he goes to Tampa, wins a couple of cups, goes to Nashville, back to Tampa. That's kind of where things stand now. I guess in theory it could still happen, but I'm not really holding my breath that Fox and McDonagh will be teammates. But regardless, Adam Fox, take a quick look at him. Perennial Norris candidate, basically do-it-all defenseman, logs just a crazy amounts of ice time pretty much every single game. Playoff success, 39 points in 46 career playoff games. The regular season, 308 points in 357 games with the Rangers. So nearly a point per game status for a defenseman here. And really with Fox, he was basically a star right from the moment he debuted. I think it was pretty obvious fairly early into his Ranger tenure that, we had a special player here. And Fortunate that he basically just fell into the Rangers' lap. But, Norris Trophy winner, top 5 Norris finisher for the last 4 seasons. He's never been lower than 5th. And this was interesting, too. 74 points in 2021-2022. That was the most for a Ranger defenseman since Brian Leetch in 2000, 2001. And as the same can be said for a lot of Rangers from, Fox's era here, part of a couple of deep playoff runs to the Eastern Conference Final. And obviously, we hope one day it will lead deeper than that. It will go farther than that. And Adam Fox will be lifting a Stanley Cup. But I think this roster needs some retooling between now and then. The other defenseman, we just mentioned him, we just talked about Adam Fox. Ryan McDonagh, another hard-nosed defenseman from the mid-2010s. He was captain for several seasons, obviously, provided a lot of valuable leadership and experience for a lot of those teams that made deep playoff runs for that era of Ranger hockey. Back in the mid-2010s there, of course, they made it to the finals in 2014. I found this interesting, too, because with McDonagh, certainly he was capable of chipping in offensively, but here's a stat for you. So 65 points in 191 playoff games with the Rangers, all-time leader in playoff points by a Ranger defenseman. That's a pretty wild stat. Regular season, 516 games, 51 goals, 187 assists. And, as far as like a clutch moment, a big-time moment for McDonagh, I always think back, it's a goal that I think often gets forgotten. The 2015 Stanley Cup playoffs, second round, Rangers and Caps, Game 5. Rangers are down 3-1. They tie it late in regulation. It goes to overtime, and Ryan McDonagh is able to score a couple of minutes into the overtime period and extend the Rangers season. Now, of course, what happened there, the Rangers went on to win Game 6, and then they won Game 7 on the Derek Stepan overtime winner. We talked about that a little bit earlier in today's episode. But that Stepan Game 7 winner, that gets all the attention, and understandably so. It's Game 7 overtime. The stakes don't get any bigger than that. But there is no Derek Stepan Game 7 overtime winner without the Ryan McDonagh Game 5 overtime winner. So a clutch moment by the captain there, and obviously extended that Ranger playoff run that season. Moving along to the forward. So there's going to be a couple that are controversial here, but I'm actually going to stick up for a couple of the names on this list, even though I haven't been sticking up for a lot of these players recently. The first is Chris Kreider. Does he belong on this list? Yes. Does he belong on the first team? Also, yes. I realize, and a lot of you will agree with me on this, Chris Kreider has had a subpar season this year, to say the least. There just seems to be something missing in his game. He's not really playing with any energy. It's possible that part of this can be chalked up due to lingering injury issue, the back, whatever it might be here. And if that's the case, then okay. But bottom line, it just hasn't been good enough for Chris Kreider this season. He has 2 assists the entire season. This despite basically always playing in the top 6. He's been on the third line recently, but for the most part, he's been a top 6er and always being on that top power play unit. So despite all this, Kreider has been a staple of Ranger hockey for 14 seasons, and even though he's that player that always leaves you wanting a little bit more and believing he has another level that he can get to, you can't really call Kreider anything other than a success story for what he's done throughout his entire career with the Rangers. Again, a decade and a half pretty much as a New York Ranger. He's had some big playoff moments for sure. I think none bigger than that hat trick that he had in Game 6 against the Canes this past postseason. He's racked up a lot of points in the playoffs as Chris Kreider. Nobody in this quarter century has more points for the Rangers than Chris Kreider. 565 points in 847 games. He also leads the team in goals in that time with 316. And I realize some of these stats are due in large part for how long that he's been here. But, in an era of really pro sports where guys are always bouncing from team to team, and the fact that Kreider did stay here the entire time, it's become increasingly rare, especially in hockey. And I think he deserves some props for that. If you can believe this, just 3 years ago, Chris Kreider was also a winner of the Stephen McDonald Extra Effort Award. I don't think he's going to be really in the running for that this year, but that's just me. You guys can let me know if you feel differently. But yeah, look, the numbers are up there as far as the all-time Ranger list. He's at or near the top of a whole bunch of different rankings. Also, the all-time leader in playoff games among Ranger skaters with 123 and goals scored in the playoffs with 48. So these are impressive numbers any way that you slice it. But moving on now to Mika Zibanejad. little bit of a controversial pick for, the first team here. I'm going to address that a little bit later. Basically, it's the same deal as Chris Kreider. You could be mad or upset or frustrated or angry or infuriated or whatever with how Mika Zibanejad has played this season. You're not alone. Certainly on this podcast, we've given him a piece of our mind several different times. So it's easy to understand why people are fed up with Mika, especially when you look at that contract and realize we got another 5.5 years to go here before that contract expires. However, in this quarter century, Mika Zibanejad is second on the Rangers with 548 points in 603 games. The Rangers basically stole him away from the Ottawa Senators, and he had some fantastic seasons as a member of the Rangers. Nobody can ever take that away. The playoffs, he's done well there too. 58 playoff games for the Rangers, 55 points in those 58 games. So nearly a point per game. It does feel like over the years he's been very hot and cold in the playoffs, has because of Zibanejad, but he's also had some big moments. I think back to a couple of years ago, first round against the Penguins, Game 7. We know that Panarin won it in overtime, but that was all set up by Mika Zibanejad tying the game with about 5 minutes to go there. He was an all-star in 2022. I mean, God, that's only 3 years ago. It's wild to think about. And he was also the Stephen McDonald Extra Effort Award winner. You have to go back a little bit longer for this one, but 2019, 2020, he won it 2 years in a row. What happened, man? What happened to this guy on every level, And I know he's older, but he's 31. He turns 30 and his game falls off a cliff. It's hard to believe, man. Kind of wild, but he does deserve a place. I'm going to spoil the next segment. I would put him on the second team, and I'll explain why a little bit later. But Artemi Panarin to round out the first team, it had to be Panarin. Bottom line, one of the most exciting players in the history of this team. Just a blast to watch him play hockey. The centerpiece of the Ranger rebuild. That's always what I call him. They had to do something big in free agency, hopefully to get other players to want to come here. He's been a big part of a couple of different playoff runs at this point. He's got the iconic moment, the Game 7 overtime winner against the Penguins. Last year's playoff run, Game 3 overtime winner against the Canes. That put the Rangers up 3-0. And thank God for that, because that series started to get away from the Rangers, and then they finally put it to bed in Game 6. But that was a huge goal in retrospect. As far as playoffs, 35 points in 46 games, All-Star in 2020, 2023, member of the NHL first All-Star team in 2020 and 2024, member of the second team in 2023. Bottom line, look, he's been one of the best players in the NHL for a very long time, really even before he got to the Rangers, and he will go down, even if the Rangers don't win a Stanley Cup with Artemi Panarin as a member of the team, he will go down as one of the best UFA signings in Ranger history. It worked out great. And I think with Panarin, and I don't know if something like this is taken into account for a list such as this, but one of his biggest contributions for this team, I've always talked about this, his ability to elevate everybody around him. You put somebody on the same line as Artemi Panarin, and they're going to see an uptick in production far more often than not. So, yeah, great pick there. Can't argue with Panarin being on the first team. So we're going to keep everything going. In just a second, we're going to, pretty much stay on topic. I'm going to have some final thoughts on both these lists here, these two different teams, the second team and the first team. Talk about any adjustments that I would make, and maybe go through a couple of guys that weren't necessarily snubbed, but guys that I hope were at least in consideration, and maybe in some cases were snubbed. We'll talk about all that in just a second. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here. On Locked On New York Rangers, some final thoughts. I got to say, man, I think they pretty much nailed this list. There's always things you can nitpick. And if you, me, and this person and that person, if we're all going to do this and put together our own individual list of first team and second team Rangers for, the quarter century here, we're going to come up with some different answers for sure. The one big change that I would make here, I got to have Jaromir Jagr, not just on the second team, but on the first team. What I would probably do is flip-flop Jagr and Mika. And it's not just because Mika Zibanejad has had an atrocious season. It goes beyond that. Jagr was an absolutely dominant player. And I think hockey, more so than probably any of the other major sports, is the most difficult sport for one individual player to just go out there and dominate. Football, the quarterback, if you've got an elite quarterback, that's half the battle these days in the NFL, right? So there's that. If you want to look at basketball, that's always been a superstar-driven league. There's no doubt about that. baseball, I mean, if you have like a beast of a starting pitcher, maybe, but even still, they only pitch one out of every 5 days anyway. Hockey is the most difficult sport, I think, for one player to go out there and dominate, and that's exactly what Jaromir Jagr did. He led this Ranger team out of some really, really dark times, got them back to the playoffs for the first time in 8 years. That was his 123-point season. Led basically a Ranger resurgence and elevated, like Panarin, elevated a lot of guys that he played with. Michael Nylander, Martin Straka, Marty Ruchinsky. These are guys that all come to mind. Those are some blasts from the past right there. But I don't know. With Mika, him being on the first team instead of Jagr, I think it comes down to the fact that Mika's been here for like a decade now, give or take. And Jagr, if you can believe it, was only here for parts of 4 seasons. So obviously, Mika's had more time to rack up numbers, but Mika, even when we had good Mika, even when we had awesome Mika, Stephen McDonald, extra effort award Mika, all-star Mika, unstoppable on a breakaway Mika, even when we had that guy, he wasn't dominating games the way that Jagr was. Jagr was just a force, and teams basically just had no answer, while he was a member of the Rangers. So that's the one change that I would definitely make. Honorable mentions as far as forwards go. I saw a couple people throwing out Rick Nash. I mean, you could make a case there. I think a lack of playoff success probably hurt him a little bit. Just 17 goals and 26 assists in 85 playoff games. And if you go back and look at his offensive numbers, and I realize, Nash was a solid defensive forward too, but you go back and look at his numbers, they're not special, really. Like, if we're being honest, I mean, he never got a point per game, which is not an easy thing to do, but only once was he really all that close. So I've got no issue with him missing it. Nash was a solid player for this team, no doubt about it. Part of some deep playoff runs like a lot of other guys on this list, but I'm not including him on either one of these teams. Another name that I came up with here was Marian Gaborik. Only 4 seasons with the Rangers. Just didn't have enough time with the Rangers to rack up the point totals that a lot of these other guys did. But in 255 games, he had 114 goals, 115 assists for a total of 229 points. But again, something that I think probably hurts him is the lack of playoff success. Just 6 goals, 7 assists in 25 playoff games with the Rangers. Now, he ended up being a beast in the playoffs the year that the Kings won the Stanley Cup, and he won a Stanley Cup there. So good for him. But I can understand why Gaborik was left off of this list. Hopefully he got some consideration and some votes or whatever. But yeah, no issue with him missing it. You could honestly make a case for Mark Messier. I know I talked about him like right at the start of this episode and used him as an example of him probably not making it. As uneventful as that second Messier stint was with the Rangers, though, he put up a decent amount of points, like more than you probably remember. Go back and look at Messier's stats. I think there's a case to be made for Messier, but still, I don't think I would put him in there over any of the forwards. Martin Straka, if he was here for longer than 3 seasons, I think he would have had a chance because he put up some big numbers. Peter Nedved, I almost said Peter Laviolette. Peter Laviolette's not going to cut it. Peter Nedved, though, better numbers than I think you might remember with the Rangers. Again, go back and look it up. But I think the fact that they never made the playoffs when Nedved was here, that certainly doesn't help his case. He was kind of in that in-between era of Ranger hockey between, the team of the 90s winning the Cup and then at least being competitive for a few years after that. And then the Henrik Lundqvist era, he was here between all that, which was not a fun era of Ranger hockey. And Ryan Callahan, I think something that works against him might be the way that he left and the fact that he missed out on that run to the Cup Finals in 2014. But he was the captain and obviously an effective player while he was here. As far as honorable mention defensemen, again, I'm going to do what I did with Messier here. Brian Leetch, he actually could make this team, possibly over Stahl. He was here until 2004, was Brian Leetch, which is later than I would have guessed before I looked up the numbers for this. Still very productive. He had 79 points in 2000, 2001. The rest of the team was falling apart, but Brian Leetch was still a beast. And, 272 games, 46 goals, 144 assists. I don't know. I mean, I might almost do that. I might put Leetch in there instead of Mark Stahl. Again, I think you think of Brian Leetch and you think of him more with the 90s. You associate him a lot more closely with those teams than the 2000s teams. But there's a case to be made here for Leetch, and I think I might actually do that. Flip-flop him and Stahl. Other defensemen, I mean, there's really nobody else. I mean, Anton Strawman was always kind of a personal favorite of mine, but I can't put him on this list in front of any of these other guys. Lindgren's always been a personal favorite of mine, but he's been falling apart this season and played better recently for sure. But I can't put him on this list over anybody that was mentioned. So that pretty much does it. I mean, overall, again, I think they pretty much nailed this list. You can nitpick a couple things here and there. If you have any ideas, if you have, somebody that you think should have made the second team instead of being left off, or if you would boot this guy off of the list altogether, certainly let me know in the comment section. Be interested to see what you guys can come up with. But yeah, I figure we can pretty much call it there. The only other bit of news that I want to share real quick here at the end, at practice here today, Thursday, as I'm recording this, Johnny Brodzinski was in the lineup in place of Arthur Kaliev, and there are people losing their minds. Guys, is it really that big of a deal? Brodzinski hasn't played a game since January 11th. The guy's collecting dust. And I realize that you watch this last game and you see how many mistakes were made by the high-paid players on the Rangers. And there's people saying, scratch Mika, scratch Kreider, do this, do that. I'm operating under the assumption that they're not going to scratch Mika and they're not going to scratch Kreider. They already scratched Kreider once. Does Mika deserve a healthy scratching by now in the season? Yeah, probably. I'm just not holding my breath. I think the move in and of itself is fine. It's okay if Johnny Brodzinski plays a hockey game. He's kind of an energy guy, skates hard, plays hard. I think maybe that's the idea that they're looking for that. Just give this team a little bit of a jolt of energy. Kaliev's done fine. He's actually got 5 points in 10 games as a Ranger, and we know he can shoot the puck, but I don't know. Like watching these games, he's not standing out to me as much as maybe he's standing out to some other people. I don't know. To me, it's just not that big of a deal. The Rangers, if we're being honest, have much bigger issues than Brodzinski playing a game over Kaliev. But yeah, I figure we can call it there. If you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Once again, that is lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter as well, @jchick17. Once again, @jchik17. And definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.